Derek Holt showed up on Thanksgiving morning with 2 security guards, a manila envelope, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knocked on the door of apartment 4B like he owned the place, because, technically, he did. Walter and Mae Chambers had lived in that apartment for 32 years. They had painted those walls, worn grooves into those floorboards, buried a cat in a shoebox in the back courtyard. And on a Thursday morning, when the whole country was supposed to be counting its blessings, Derek Holt had come to take it all away. He slid the eviction notice under their door the night before, a legal technicality about a noise complaint that Walter, a 71-year-old man with a bad hip and a hearing aid, had allegedly caused. Nobody in the building believed it, but Derek didn't need them to believe it. He just needed it to stick long enough to get the Chambers out. Nobody saw him make the call to his property manager at 11 the night before, whispering into his phone that he needed this done before the holiday weekend so the construction crew could start Monday. Nobody noticed the small thing Mae did after she read the notice, the way she folded it carefully, placed it on the kitchen table, and picked up her phone to call her son. That one phone call was the beginning of the end for Derek Holt. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. Walter Chambers had moved into Sycamore Arms in 1992. Back then, the building was owned by a quiet Greek man named Mr. Papadopoulos who collected rent in person, fixed leaks within 24 hours, and brought baklava to the hallway every Christmas. Walter had been 29, newly married, and driving a city bus 6 days a week. Mae had been 27, working the overnight shift at County General as a nursing aide. They couldn't afford much. But Sycamore Arms, with its scuffed tile lobby and creaking elevator and view of the oak tree in the courtyard, felt like the most dignified thing they had ever owned, even though they didn't own it at all. 32 years later, they were still there. Mr. Papadopoulos had died in 2019 and left the building to his nephew, who sold it within 8 months to a real estate investment group. Derek Holt was the face of that group. He was 38, trim, perpetually tan, and carried himself with the energy of a man who had never once been told no. He wore blazers over t-shirts and talked about repositioning assets, like the people inside those assets weren't human beings. He had already flipped 3 buildings on the east side of the city. Sycamore Arms was his 4th, and Walter and Mae were the last tenants standing between him and a full vacant renovation. He had already gotten rid of the Garcias on the 2nd floor with a rent increase they couldn't survive. He had pressured the Nuyens out with a mold remediation notice that conveniently required them to vacate for 90 days, and then changed the locks while they were gone. He had let the heat run low through February until old Mr. Drummond on the 3rd floor finally gave up and moved in with his daughter. Derek had done all of this quietly, legally, and without ever raising his voice. He was a professional, and Walter and Mae were just the next line on his spreadsheet. The eviction notice cited a noise complaint filed on November 10th. It claimed Walter had been playing music above permissible decibel levels on 3 separate occasions. The document looked official. It had case numbers and legal language and a court date listed for December 3rd. What it did not have was a single shred of truth. Walter Chambers had not played loud music. Walter Chambers could barely hear the television without turning the volume to 60. But the notice had been filed through Derek's Property Management, LLC. Signed by a third-party compliance officer Derek had on retainer, and stamped with enough bureaucratic weight to confuse and terrify a couple who had never in their lives been taken to court. Mae read the notice twice. Then she sat down slowly in the kitchen chair, the one with the cracked armrest she kept meaning to fix, and she pressed both hands flat on the table like she was trying to keep herself from floating away. Walter stood in the doorway of the kitchen in his robe and slippers, reading the paper she had handed him, his jaw tight, his eyes moving carefully across every line. "This isn't real," he said quietly. "Mae, this isn't real. It has a court date on it, Walter. That doesn't make it real. What does it make it then?" He didn't answer because he didn't know. He set the paper down next to her hands and stood there in the kitchen that smelled like the sweet potato pie she had baked the night before. The kitchen where they had fed their son breakfast for 18 years. The kitchen where they had celebrated retirements and birthdays and survived the death of their second child at 4 days old. And he felt something move through his chest that he had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not fear, something older and heavier than both. Mae picked up her phone and called Marcus. It was 11:47 at night. Marcus answered on the second ring because Marcus always answered when his mother called, no matter the hour. He was in his home office in Hartford, 214 miles away, reviewing a deposition transcript with a glass of water going warm beside him. He heard her voice, and he knew immediately that something was wrong, not from what she said, but from what she didn't say. Mae Chambers was a woman who filled silence with warmth. When the silence was empty, it meant the warmth had been frightened out of her. She told him about the notice. She read him the case number. She described Derek Holt, the blazers, the clipboard visits, the way he looked at their apartment like it was already empty. Marcus listened without interrupting. He asked her to take a photograph of the notice and text it to him. He told her not to worry. He told her he loved her. He told her to go to sleep. He did not go to sleep. By midnight, Marcus had pulled the LLC registration for Derek's property management company, cross-referenced it against the city's housing court filings, and identified 4 procedural violations in the eviction notice alone. By 1 in the morning, he had called his colleague Dana Osai, a fair housing attorney who owed him a favor from a federal case they had worked together in 2021. By 2 in the morning, he was on his laptop drafting a complaint to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, flagging a pattern of displacement that, when mapped across Derek Holt's 3 previous buildings, showed a statistical concentration of Black and Latino long-term tenants being removed within the first 18 months of ownership. By 3 in the morning, Marcus Chambers had packed a bag, set his coffee maker to brew at 6, and gone to lie down for 2 hours before the drive. He had planned to surprise his parents for Thanksgiving anyway. He just hadn't planned to bring a briefcase. Thanksgiving morning arrived grey and cold, the kind of cold that felt personal. Mae was up at 6, moving through the kitchen by habit, pulling out the roasting pan, unwrapping the turkey she had brined the night before. Walter sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, watching the news with the volume too high, the eviction notice still sitting on the counter because neither of them had wanted to move it. It felt dangerous to touch, like a trap that hadn't fully sprung yet. At 9:15, the knock came. Not a polite knock. 3 hard, flat strikes against the door, the kind designed to communicate authority before the door was even open. Walter set his coffee mug down. Mae turned off the burner. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and something passed between them, 32 years of language that had no words. Walter opened the door. Derek Holt stood in the hallway in a charcoal blazer and dark jeans, holding his clipboard, flanked by 2 men in black jackets who were not quite large enough to be intimidating, but were clearly trying. Derek's expression was the worst kind, not cruel, not angry, but bored. The expression of a man who had done this before and expected it to go the same way it always did. "Mr. Chambers," Derek said, not waiting to be greeted, "I trust you received the notice." "I did," Walter said. "Then you understand that as of today, your tenancy is in violation and we're initiating the removal process. I'm going to need you and your wife to begin vacating the premises. You have until 6 o'clock this evening to remove personal belongings. Anything left after that point will be catalogued and stored." Walter stared at him. "It's Thanksgiving." "I'm aware of that. We have nowhere to go. Mr. Chambers, I understand this is difficult." "No," Walter said, and his voice was low and steady and quiet in a way that made Derek stop talking. "No, you don't understand it. You don't understand any of it. We have been in this apartment since before you knew what a mortgage was. My wife raised our son in this apartment. My wife grieved our daughter in this apartment. I painted these walls with my own 2 hands in 1993 because the previous owner gave us the paint, and I wanted to do something with my hands that felt like it mattered. And you are standing in my doorway on Thanksgiving Day telling me that a noise complaint, is why we have to leave. Derek's expression didn't change. The notice was properly filed, Mr. Chambers. I'm not here to debate the circumstances. Then why are you here? To ensure compliance. Mae appeared at Walter's shoulder. She was still wearing her apron. She smelled like nutmeg and sage. She looked at Derek Holt with the calm, clear eyes of a woman who had seen a great deal of this world and had stopped being surprised by its cruelty without ever once accepting it. The turkey's in the oven, she said simply. It needs 4 hours. You can wait downstairs. Derek blinked. Ma'am, I don't think you understand the seriousness. I understand it perfectly, Mae said. I've understood it since November 10th when you filed a complaint about a noise my husband didn't make. I've understood it since February when you let the heat drop to 58 degrees and Mr. Drummond got pneumonia. I understand exactly what's happening here, and I'm telling you the turkey needs 4 hours. She put her hand on the door. Our son is coming for dinner, she said. You can talk to him. Derek laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. The kind of laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all, but a way of reminding someone that their words had no weight. He looked at the 2 men beside him, then back at me, and shook his head slowly like he was dealing with a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. Ma'am, with all due respect, your son being here doesn't change the legal standing of the notice. The filing is valid, the court date is set, and if you choose not to begin vacating today, we will be forced to escalate through the courts, which will result in a formal marshal's removal. That process is significantly less comfortable than what I'm offering you right now. Mae looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door, untied her apron, and folded it over the back of the kitchen chair. Walter stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his jaw set, watching Derek the way a man watches a storm he cannot stop but refuses to run from. We're not leaving, Walter said. Mr. Chambers. We are not leaving. The words were not loud. They were not theatrical. They were the words of a man who had made a decision somewhere deep in his chest and had nothing left to negotiate. Derek stared at him for a moment, recalibrated, and then straightened his jacket. I'll be back at 6, Derek said. I strongly encourage you to use the time wisely. Turned and walked back down the hallway, the 2 men trailing behind him, their footsteps echoing off the tile. Walter closed the door. He stood with his hand on the knob for a moment, his back to me, his shoulders very still. Then he turned around and his eyes were glassy and red at the edges, but his face was composed, and Mae crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put both arms around him without saying a word. He held onto her the way people hold onto the things they are terrified of losing. They stood like that in the kitchen for a long time, the turkey quietly roasting, the oak tree outside losing its last leaves in the cold November wind. At 11:43 in the morning, a car pulled into the Sycamore Arms parking lot. Marcus Chambers was 42 years old, 6'1", and wore the kind of quiet confidence that had nothing to do with the way he was dressed and everything to do with what he knew. He had graduated top of his class from Howard University School of Law in 2007. He had spent 4 years at the DOJ's Civil Rights Division before moving to private practice. He was currently a senior partner at Callaway, Osa and Chambers, a firm he had helped build from a 3-person office into one of the most respected fair housing litigation practices in the Northeast. He drove a sensible grey sedan and carried a briefcase that had seen the inside of 17 federal courtrooms. He also still called his mother every Sunday without fail, and he had been known to cry at her sweet potato pie. He took the stairs to the 4th floor because the elevator was slow, and he was almost at the landing when he heard voices in the hallway above him. He paused on the stairwell, listening. He heard Derek's voice, clipped, professional, rehearsed, and then he heard his father's voice, low and steady, and then his mother's voice, calm as still water. And something shifted in Marcus's chest, something that had been quietly tightening since 11:47 the night before, something that he had kept carefully controlled through the drafting and the filing and the 200-mile drive. It shifted, and it became something precise and focused and cold. He waited until he heard the footsteps retreating down the hall. Then he waited another 30 seconds. Then he walked up the last flight of stairs and knocked on the door of apartment 4B with 3 gentle knocks, the kind that said, "I'm here and you're safe," and I came as fast as I could. Mae opened the door. For a moment, she just looked at him. Then she made a sound that wasn't quite a word and pulled him into her arms, and Marcus held his mother in the doorway of the apartment he had grown up in and closed his eyes and breathed her in nutmeg and sage and the faint lavender of her hand lotion, and he let himself feel it for exactly 10 seconds. Then he stepped back, kissed her forehead, and looked over her shoulder at his father. Walter was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee. He looked older than the last time Marcus had seen him, and smaller somehow, and that fact landed in Marcus's chest like a stone dropping into deep water. "Hey, Pop. You drove all night." "Most of it." Walter nodded slowly, the way men of his generation acknowledged things they were too moved to say out loud. "There's coffee." "I know," Marcus said. "I need to make a phone call first." He sat down at the kitchen table, opened his briefcase, and spread 3 documents flat in front of him. His parents stood nearby, watching as Marcus dialed Dana Ose and put the call on speaker. "It's filed," Dana said without preamble. "HUD received the complaint at 2:17 this morning. I also cross-filed with the State Attorney General's Fair Housing Division. Given the pattern across his previous 3 properties, we're looking at a potential systemic discrimination case, not just a single eviction. His LLC is exposed on at least 2 federal statutes." "What's our position if he comes back today?" Marcus asked. "He has no legal authority to remove them today. The notice has a procedural defect. He served it through the LLC without proper licensure under the State Property Management Act. It's void on its face. If he attempts a physical removal, that's unlawful interference, and we can seek emergency injunctive relief before end of business." "Good, thank you, Dana. Tell your mom I said Happy Thanksgiving." Marcus ended the call. He looked up at his parents. Mae had both hands pressed together in front of her mouth. Walter had set his coffee down and was very still. "You're not going anywhere," Marcus said simply. "Not today, not next week, not ever if I have anything to say about it." Mae sat down across from him and reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "How bad is it?" "For him," Marcus said, "it's bad." He explained it the way he always explained things to his parents, clearly, without condescension, with the same respect he gave a jury. He told them about the procedural defect in the notice. He told them about the LLC's improper licensure. He told them about the pattern he had mapped across Derek's 4 buildings, the demographics of the displaced tenants, the timing of the complaints, the gap between what was filed and what was true. He told them that what Derek had done to them was not just wrong. It was a federal fair housing violation, and it was documented, and it was the kind of thing that ended careers and dissolved LLCs and resulted in the kind of penalties that made real estate investors choose different cities. Walter listened to all of it. Then he picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the oak tree for a long moment. "I just want to stay in my home," he said quietly. "I know, Pop. That's all. I'm not interested in punishing anybody. I just want to stay in my home." "I know," Marcus said again. "And you will, but he's going to find that out the hard way." Derek Holt returned at 6 o'clock exactly. He had brought a 3rd man this time, broader than the other 2, and he had traded the clipboard for a manila folder, which he held with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular performance many times before. He knocked on the door of apartment 4B and waited with the patient, bored confidence of a man who had never once lost this kind of standoff. Marcus opened the door. Derek looked at him for a moment, recalibrating, the way a person recalibrates when the door opens and the room is not what they expected. Marcus was still in his travel clothes, dark trousers, a grey sweater, no tie. He was holding nothing. His expression was completely neutral. "Can I help you?" Marcus said. "I'm looking for Walter Chambers. He's having dinner. I'm his son. How can I help you?" Derek glanced past him into the apartment, then back at Marcus. "And you are?" "Marcus Chambers, senior partner, Callaway, Osa and Chambers, fair housing litigation." He paused just long enough for that to settle. "I also filed the HUD complaint against your LLC at 2:17 this morning, co-filed with the state AG's office, and I have a draft motion for emergency injunctive relief sitting in my email ready to send the moment you attempt to remove my parents from this apartment." The color shifted in Derek's face. It was subtle, a slight draining around the jaw, a tightening at the corners of his eyes. But Marcus had spent 15 years watching people receive bad news across tables, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. "Your LLC," Marcus continued, his voice unhurried and even, "is not properly licensed under Section 12 of the State Property Management Act, which means the eviction notice it issued is procedurally void. In addition, when I map the tenant displacement pattern across the 4 properties your investment group has acquired in the past 3 years, what emerges is a statistically significant concentration of Black and Latino long-term tenants being removed within 18 months of purchase. That pattern, combined with the pretextual nature of the complaints used to justify those removals, constitutes a prima facie case under the Fair Housing Act. You are not here to enforce a lease violation, Mr. Holt. You are standing at the center of a federal fair housing investigation." The hallway was very quiet. One of the men behind Derek shifted his weight. Derek's jaw moved slightly, like he was composing a sentence and discarding it. "I'd recommend," Marcus said, "that your next call be to your attorney, not your property manager, your attorney." He looked at Derek Holt for one more moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the flat, clear eyes of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the other person to understand it. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "My mother made sweet potato pie," Marcus said. "You have a good evening." He closed the door. Inside apartment 4B, the table was set. The turkey was golden and rested and ready. Mae's cornbread was still warm in the pan. Walter sat at the head of the table in the chair he had sat in for 32 Thanksgivings, the oak tree dark and quiet outside the window, the apartment smelling like every good thing they had ever built together. Marcus sat down across from his father, unfolded his napkin, and reached across the table for his mother's hand. They said grace. 6 weeks later, Derek Holt's LLC was dissolved by court order. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into the displacement practices across all 4 properties. 3 of Derek's displaced tenants filed civil suits with Dana Osai as lead counsel. Walter and Mae Chambers signed a new 10-year lease at their original rent, protected under an emergency fair housing preservation order. The oak tree in the courtyard was still standing. It had been there longer than Derek Holt, and it would be there long after he was gone. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength is still strength, that love shows up with a briefcase when it has to, and that 32 years of dignity cannot be folded into a manila envelope and taken away. Hit that like button, drop a comment below telling us what part of Walter and Mae's story hit you the hardest, and subscribe to Nicholas Stories for more powerful, soul-stirring stories just like this one. We'll see you in the next one.